It is an immense pleasure for me to chair and moderate this roundtable, which I and my colleagues in the Rectorate have organized with the Department of Historical Studies in honor of Michael Ignatieff, who served as the president and rector of CEU between 2016 and 2021, and then returned to the classroom where he always felt so much at ease, teaching history for the past 5 years to scores of lucky students. It is a happy coincidence that we can celebrate his retirement in the festive year of our 35th anniversary, given his invaluable contributions to the thriving of our institution during the 5 years at the helm of CEU. His tenure as president and rector began, as you recall, with the Orban regime's unprecedented attack against the very principles of academic freedom and autonomy at the heart of Europe, and ended with our university's relocation to its new home in Vienna during the tumultuous years of the global pandemic. This experience of fighting one battle after another to ensure the survival of CEU revealed clearly the existential entanglement of the fates of universities and democracies. Needless to say, or needless to add, it also allowed Michael Ignatieff to demonstrate his prowess and more than capable leadership, for which we remain profoundly grateful. Foreshadowing the systemic onslaught against the entire higher education sector in the United States last year, and before this already in some states of the United States, so it really didn't start last year even. The case of CEU served as a stark reminder that universities and the ideals they stand for will inevitably find themselves in the crosshairs of illiberal, authoritarian political forces. Where democracy withers away, no university worthy of the name can survive. Neither can democracy realize its promises without the norms and values embodied by universities, which raises the fundamental question of what the university as an institution could and should do to safeguard and cultivate a genuinely democratic ethos in society. It is this question that Ronald J. Daniels, president of Johns Hopkins University, former member of CEU's Board of Trustees, sought to answer in his influential book, What Universities Owe to Democracy, in 2021. A book that opens, in fact, with a prophetic story of CEU's plight under the Orban regime. A book that has been a rich source of inspiration for many of us in this room, as well as a source of consolation of finding solace in dark times, to borrow the title of Michael's latest book. What Universities Owe Democracy is also a programmatic call to arms for all of us who passionately believe in the power of ideas, critical thought, and fearless question to defend our societies from the onslaught of illiberal authoritarian forces. One could not have picked a better book, let alone a better speaker, for celebrating the many accomplishments of Michael Ignatieff. On behalf of the entire CEU community, I would like to thank President Daniels for graciously accepting our invitation and joining us on this very special occasion today. He's going to open this event with a short lecture in which he will revisit the key arguments of the book and situate them in the context of some key developments in the 5 years since its publication, of which there were many key developments, I think. While I'm sure that the talk will elicit numerous questions from the audience, I must ask you to be patient still and collect your thoughts during the round table, sort of round table, a table, or 2 tables actually, following the presentation by Professor Daniels' lecture. So without any further ado, let me briefly introduce our 3 distinguished guests for this roundtable. Ron Daniels has been the president of Johns Hopkins University since 2009. Is this normal? I mean, like... All right. So prior to that, he was provost and professor of law at the University of Pennsylvania and dean and the James M. Torrey Professor of Law at the University of Toronto, where he had earned his JD and edited the University of Toronto Faculty Law Review. In 2014, the University of Toronto awarded him the Doctor of Law honoris causa title. He also has an LLM degree from Yale University, where he has been a visiting professor in the law school. From his numerous accomplishments, and I really have to cut short here, really, I would only mention here the Order of Canada in 2016, the Carnegie Corporation of New York Academy Leadership Award in 2015, and being an elected fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So, and during his long tenure as president, Johns Hopkins has consistently ranked high and has achieved so many things, and I could list them. For the wine break, I can. So in 2021, as already mentioned, Ron Daniels published an agenda-setting book, What Universities Owe Democracies, which makes a compelling and passionate case for universities to engage in the current struggles to preserve and strengthen democratic achievements that are under threat both in the United States and elsewhere today, and we will discuss this later in detail. Universities depend on democratic values and practices for their functioning as independent institutions, and in turn, they are also indispensable for keeping the spirit of democracy alive. Now, Michael Ignatieff is currently the professor of history at Central European University here in Vienna. As CEU's former rector and president between 2016 and 2021, he oversaw the university's relocation from Budapest, fighting a valiant battle against the formidable forces of reaction in Orban's Hungary and beyond. Prior to joining CEU, he served as the Edward R. Murrow Chair of Press, Politics and Public Policy at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. At Harvard, he also directed the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy. He also held academic positions at King's College, Cambridge, the University of Toronto, and the University of British Columbia. Michael is a renowned commentator on a wide range of contemporary issues. But besides his long career as a public intellectual, he also served in the Parliament of his native Canada. Most people probably know this, where he was for a few years the leader of the Liberal Party as well. In 2024, he was awarded the Princess of Asturias Award for Social Sciences. And he is the author of numerous award-winning books, including several novels. And there are 17 books, Michael. Is this true? That's also not normal, but his latest one is On Consolation, Finding Solace in Dark Times in 2021. And if I'm not mistaken, you are currently writing a memoir with a working title, The History of Our Privileges. Okay, I hope I didn't give too much away here. Last but certainly not least, Cornelia Woll is professor of international political economy at the Hertie School in Berlin, where she also served as president between 2022 and 2026. Before joining Hertie, she spent 16 years as a professor of political science at Sciences Po in Paris, where she was president of the academic board, vice president for studies and academic affairs, associate dean for research, as well as co-director of the Max Planck Sciences Po Center and the Interdisciplinary Center for the Evaluation of Public Policy. She has held fellowships and visited the Center for European Studies at Harvard, the European University Institute, the BMW Center for German and European Studies at Georgetown, and, as Ron will be pleased to hear, the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies at Johns Hopkins. In 2023, Cornelia was elected to the Berlin-Brandenburg Academy of Sciences and Humanities, as well as the Academia Europaea. So besides serving on the executive board of the Einstein Foundation, and I'm coming to an end here soon, the academic advisory board of the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford, and several other institutions in France and Germany, Cornelia is also a member of CEU's Board of Trustees. So we are especially pleased to welcome you here at this event tonight. Her fields and expertise are international political economy and economic sociology, and we just before the meeting talked about your latest project, which links cryptocurrencies to autocratic policy, something I thought I hadn't thought as a problem, but it clearly seems to be one. So I'm very much looking forward to reading this soon. So once again, let me thank our speakers for participating in this roundtable, to which we are all eagerly looking forward. And I now give the floor to President Daniels for the introductory lecture on how universities can sustain democracies today. Thank you.
Carsten, thank you so much for that very warm introduction. And just let me say at the outset how great it is to be back at CEU. The last time I was at the university was during its reaccreditation process at a time where the university was under some considerable challenge. And it's just great to be here and see the university thriving. That's not missed a beat. And as well, Carsten, to be led by you, such an impressive political science and well-published scholar, I think, again, is another treat. So wonderful to be here. I would say when you think about the standard way in which we say goodbye to colleagues who have been present and active in institutions, you know the way it usually goes. There's short remarks, a reception, a series of toasts, a night of levity and libations. Maybe that will come here, maybe not. But this particular honoree had a different view, opted to begin his retirement celebration with a multi-hour lecture and roundtable on the current state of democracy and the role of universities in strengthening and sustaining democratic systems. That's Michael Ignatieff, a retiree with a difference. Now, it likely comes as no surprise to anyone here, as he has devoted his extraordinary 5+ decade career to addressing these questions in journals and academic forums, but also on television screens and in legislative halls on both sides of the Atlantic. He is really a distinguished public intellectual. He is, of course, a scholar at heart and a true torchbearer of democracy's flame. And I saw this, of course, as I referenced, I was here 5-6 years ago in Budapest, watching Michael fight to preserve CEU's autonomy and academic freedom in the midst of what was truly an unprecedented affront. And so, as Carsten said a moment ago, it's not entirely by surprise that when I embarked upon this project of writing the case for universities in liberal democracy, I naturally opened with a description of that experience and being in Hungary during the time when the university was under assault. Indeed, I think it's fair to say few universities have more vividly embodied the book's guiding message, a living commitment to the idea that universities have a fundamental role to play in ensuring that their values of tolerance, dissent, the free flow of information are protected during times of autocratic pressure. Now, of course, we're here in Vienna, a byproduct of CEU's forced decampment and the eroding trust and vulnerability of institutions. But for me, I see your presence here, the brick and mortar home as representing the boundless spirit of dialogue and discourse, as a truly stirring embodiment of the enduring power of this institution, its values, and indeed the very idea of a research university. So, with CEU and its living example as the backdrop once more, I want to use my time here at the lectern to detail a few thoughts on the longstanding relationship of universities and their role in democracy, and to consider the state of that relationship 5 years after the publication of the book that Carsten referred to a few moments ago, What Universities Owe Democracy. Now, it's worth just mentioning, although I think there's some general application beyond the borders of the United States to some of the ideas I develop in the book. Not surprisingly, I was writing from the context of the United States and a lot of the trends and pressures that were underway there. And so that's a principal place in which I make my arguments. But I'm hoping that some of the ideas I share here will have some salience to all of you in the room. Now, one of the reasons that I decided to embark upon the writing of the book was because I really felt, first and foremost, that the case for the role of the university in liberal democracy was not fully explicated. And, you know, over the years, I've been in various contexts where people say, well, universities are important in democracy because of their educative role, or they're important because of the role that they play in essentially ensuring high levels of social mobility. But fundamentally, the comprehensive case for the university as a bulwark institution of liberal democracy was not, at least to my mind, well established. And indeed, more than that, although when you talk to people and say, what do you regard as the core institutions of liberal democracy? You know, typically it's independent judiciary, It's elected and accountable legislators and a multi-party legislative system. It's a free press. But it's actually interesting that universities, at least, aren't often first off the lips of people, first out of their mouth when they talk about those core institutions. So for me, the principal project of the book was first and foremost to establish what is the case for the institution as a key institution, and what is the case for the university as a key institution in liberal democracy, and to set out the precise ways in which that holds. And so very quickly, the case I make focuses on four different rationales. First, universities advance social mobility, launching students up the socioeconomic ladder. And to the extent that they honor the Jeffersonian ideal of equal opportunity to people of equal merit, this becomes a powerful way in which you build support for the strength of democracy and basically allowing merit to rise and to lift people out of their circumstances when it's deserved. Second, they educate students in the values, history, skills, and aspirations necessary for good citizenship. They steward facts and cultivate expertise that can inform the public and policymakers, and most importantly, serve as a locus for checking, disciplining political power. Indeed, the power of a number of different actors, not just confined to the public sector. And finally, for me, the university is important because it can serve as a place in which you can demonstrate the power of pluralism, bringing people together from vastly different backgrounds and experiences and teaching them how to meaningfully, respectfully engage across their differences. So what I want to do is just, with these four ideas out there of the role that the universities play, I just want to double back to each one of them and just say a few brief words, and then I look forward to the discussion we're going to have in a few moments. So for me at least, as I enumerated each of these areas, where I think the university at its best can discharge these roles and earn public trust and confidence, I also felt it was important to be able to evaluate, as against that aspiration, how well universities were in fact doing. And again, I think one of the things that was really quite notable and contributed to my decision to embark upon the book project was, particularly during Trump 1, the standard narrative when you got together with presidents or with colleagues from across the university, presidents of other universities, other people who were interested in the status of the university, the standard narrative of what was going on in America during Trump 1 at least was very much this sense that this was a time of crass populism, that the university was under assault unfairly with no contribution on its own in any shape or form to what was being unleashed on us. And that was at a time when, as we think about what was being unleashed on us, it certainly was much more modest than what has happened, of course, during Trump 2. But what was interesting, at least for me, was that as you canvass the possibility of at least some role for universities in having contributed to public distrust, there was little room for that narrative. Fundamentally, this was a narrative of victimization, of mass populism, but with little sense that there was any contribution and that there were any kernels of truth to some of the critiques that were swirling around us. And so this is why, as I embarked upon the project saying, what can we do at our best? I felt it was also important to basically turn our gaze onto our institutions, and I did so even with a view to my institution, to see how, in fact, we were doing. So, first, as I mentioned a moment ago, take the case of social mobility and the role that the university can play in fostering social mobility. We know all the stories about the power of universities in basically giving people not only a substantial increase in their lifetime earnings, from being graduates, but more than that, just the status, the sense of membership in society that you get from receiving a higher education. So we know the power of what this experience can do, the worlds that it opens up, but it's also, of course, worth asking how well we do in actually manifesting the commitment to ensuring that we really are an engine for social mobility and can essentially find people who are deserving of membership at our institutions and ensure, irrespective of their financial wherewithal, that they can attend university. And here it's really interesting that if you look at the very precipitous fall in public views of the role of universities and trust in universities in America, and there's no other institution over the last 10 years that has dropped more in public trust and confidence than the university. It's interesting that, by and large, the division between Republicans and Democrats who respond to that question indicates that Democrats are far more likely to be sympathetic to the university and much less skeptical of the university's role, except when it comes to questions of access to higher education. And here it's interesting that both Democratic and Republican-affiliated citizens have the same concerns. And this goes a lot to questions of whether or not the promise of access, irrespective of financial wherewithal, irrespective of circumstances, is well honored or not. One of the things that gets a lot of attention is the fact that at scores of elite universities in the United States, there are more students who come from the top 1% of the income distribution than the bottom 60%. And so again, to the extent that we're thinking about, is there a real problem there? I think this distribution says a lot about the challenge. Going beyond that, one of the peculiarities, which I know is not a feature in Europe, and it certainly wasn't a feature of the country that I was born and raised in, Canada, but even the continued role of legacy admissions at American universities is one of the most peculiar and persistent practices that even to this day, after all the attacks on higher education and access, there's still a number of institutions that still have an unvarnished and pretty intense commitment to the continuation of that practice. The idea that people have had every advantage in life, the homes that they grow up in, the schools they go to, the experiences they have, the stability of their families, the quality of the health care they receive, and nutrition and so forth. After all those advantages that several institutions feel, yet again, at the time of admission to university, the thumb should be put on the scale for people who come from families who are graduates of the institution. If there were ever assault on the core ideas of merit, that practice is certainly the case. We at Hopkins in 2018, when I came to the institution, we in fact had that practice in place. But in 2018, after several years of quietly changing our admissions practice to essentially end legacy admissions, we publicly announced we had done that. And the truth is, we had very little blowback. But nevertheless, that practice persists. And again, to the extent that we see questions about access and the idea of equal opportunity being honored or not, it's at least for me a very powerful way in which I think we undermine our case. The other thing that we have been really sensitive to is just the incredible complexity of financial aid. We say we have needs-based financial aid, but again, we know for years the criticism of, I know you say that the posted price is X, and I know you say that there's going to be some assistance that's going to come and you're going to do it on a needs basis, it's going to be principled, but it's so incredibly complex and penetrable, we can't count on it as families apply to institutions like Hopkins. And so here again, one of the things that I think has been very powerful that's happened over the last year or two has been the gross simplification of the way in which we do financial aid at several of our institutions. And now we've just basically got a very simple soundbite, which is, if you come from a family who earns less than $200,000, you come to Hopkins tuition free. If you come from a family who earns less than $100,000, you're going to get room and board on top of that. It's just a simple, clear message. So even, though we have a posted tuition level that's much higher, now the message is simple. And what's significant is, as we've made that change, we're able to say 85% of American families would now come to our institution tuition free. And again, it's just a way in which I think we're rehabilitating ourselves to truly instantiate the commitment to mobility. Let me talk about another issue, which I know again at CEU and at other European institutions, you've been much better advanced than we have been. But that is the role that the university plays in educating educating our students for their democratic responsibilities. And here, this is something that, although over the last decade or two, there's been a real movement towards so-called service learning in American higher education institutions, the very intentional education around the values of liberal democracy, the challenges that it faces, the way in which you can requite those obligations as a democratic citizen, we have not been really intentional in the way in which we have honored that particular responsibility. And for me, it was really interesting. When I was actually writing the book, I taught for 2-3 years a seminar around the book, and I can remember each year the response when I asked students who are among the best in the country or coming to Hopkins, how many of them actually in high school had received any kind of formal introduction to democratic institutions, to the institutions of American government, to some of the ideas of American democracy. And typically, only about 25-30% of the students would raise their hand. And that, in fact, comports with the more systemic studies that have been done on the way in which American students are being educated around democratic institutions and values within high school. And so here, I think, again, the case is if this is a role we can play, and particularly in light of the lamentable lapse in the way in which American students are getting educated in high school around these ideas. And again, I think it's important to emphasize, we can't just assume that you get access, with osmosis, you inherit these ideas, or they just somehow are implanted at birth. This has to be actively taught, educated to our students. And again, here is a way in which we have moved to become much more intentional around the way in which we discharge this obligation, particularly, again, because it's just not happening in American high schools. And so, again, this is an area where I have a series of recommendations about how you think about educating for democracy and doing so in a way that is, I think, congruent with a proper and bounded role for the university, and not inflicting a distinct moral perspective or ideological perspective on students, but giving them the capacity to see the array of responsibilities they have and the skills, the values that they need to function effectively as democratic citizens. Another area that I talk a lot about is the role that universities play in speaking truth to power, with the way in which we marshal facts, that we seek to use knowledge and data to be able to essentially feed into, to contribute to public debate. I know this is an idea that is very well established at CEU, and one that I don't need to spend a great deal of time talking about. But I will only say that, at least for me, one of the things that I really have worried about for years is the growing literature around reproducibility, particularly in the sciences and the social sciences, and the extent to which there is questions about the reliability of the claims that we're making. And again, to the extent that that we are purporting to feed into, discipline, and enrich public debate, but ultimately the data and the claims that we're making, if they can't be substantiated, and there's real questions of reproducibility, I think this actually reflects a very serious issue that we need to worry about, and something, again, that I spend some time talking about. I think another aspect of that issue, and one that, again, I think has come up repeatedly in the criticisms that we're now facing from the Trump allies, is the extent to which we are regarded as a very homogeneous monoculture that leans far too left progressive, but without having conservative intellectual perspectives properly anchored in the curriculum. And this is probably the most sensitive point that I raise with my colleagues. It's still one that engenders a fairly strong allergic reaction, but it's one which I think, when you look at the data and see the extent to which, particularly in the social sciences and humanities, that we have not honored and I think been properly accessible to some of the rich intellectual traditions associated with conservatives, particularly working in liberal democratic tradition. I think this is a very serious challenge for the quality of debate that we have on campuses. But more than that, what I worry about is the extent to which not only does it deprive progressives on our campuses of being exposed to ideas that would, and counter narratives that would test and I think strengthen the arguments they're making, but it is also that to the extent that we, I believe, have systematically excluded, whether inadvertently or intentionally, these traditions from our campus, it's also meant that conservative scholars have ended up at think tanks where instead of meeting people who are working from other perspectives and traditions and having to interact with and responding to some of those critiques and concerns that are raised when they advance their ideas. Instead of that, they've just basically been in themselves in very isolated monocultures where I think that the debate has become more and more extreme and distorted. So I actually, when I meet colleagues at Hopkins and discuss this and the ways in which I think we have to remediate this, I say that I think we have some role and responsibility here in thinking about ways in which we can pull conservatives back to the center in the United States. And I think having these colleagues well represented on our campuses would make a difference. The final thing I'll just say something about is the ideas of purposeful pluralism that again, I think is another very important role for the university. And when you think about it, particularly in the United States, but I know it's not only restricted to the United States, to the extent that we become more and more polarized. And, in the United States, of course, they call it the great sort, where progressives live, work, socialize with progressives, same with conservatives. So we've become more and more distant from one another. You'll know the study that regularly gets invoked to indicate the magnitude of polarization is this very dramatic drop in the number of parents who say that they would support their kids marrying into a family that comes from the opposite political parties, associated with the opposite political party. Again, just another illustration of how much distrust and cynicism there is about the role of the other party, where again, what's significant in the United States is, people increasingly see people who adhere to the values and the ideas of the opposite party, not just simply as wrong, but as evil and as ill-intentioned. So again, what the university represents, to my mind at least, is similar to military service, is 4 years when you have students in a residential experience, cheek by jowl with one another. And to the extent that we have become much more effective in creating really heterogeneous student populations, where if you've done your job well, a number of these different perspectives and experiences will be mingling in the same environment for 4 years. The idea is, how do you make sure that there's not self-replication of the same sorting that takes place out of the university that takes place that would take place in the university. And so, here we've just, done these very intentional, they seem like small perturbations, but at least to my mind, they're having big moves. For instance, we have, for the last several decades, allowed our students to pick their first-year roommates before they even get to the university. And here, not surprisingly, with social media and so forth, students, when they find each other and they pick their roommates, they typically find people who are just like them. And so what we've done is, a few years ago, we stopped that practice and said, we'll take it on now. And, again, there was a little bit of stir around the time that we did that. But it's been one of the most, I think, consequential decisions that we've made in terms of really seeing a much deeper integration with the student body. Again, I think for so many people, the question of diversity has been dealt with just in terms of the raw statistics as the composition of the class, rather than really testing how much interaction testing there is of different perspectives, where you really get the benefits of that diversity. And to my mind, that's the pluralist project. So in all of these ways, I would say, I think there's been real issues that we have to confront in thinking about our prospective role in contributing to society. I think we are an indispensable institution. I think what's been interesting over the last several years, and particularly over the last 2 years, year and a half of the Trump administration, all of these issues which I think were circulating have become much more salient. In some ways, the issues, because they're out there and we're being regularly confronted with them, typically by very, very intense critics of the university, we have no choice but to react to them. And so, in some sense, the agenda around these issues has become much more acute. On the other hand, it's not surprising that when you think about the way in which these issues are being raised and the vigor with which they are being used against us, and in particular the techniques from public recriminations to multiple investigations to efforts to suspend research funding, to the extent that those techniques are regularly being deployed, it is really hard to be able to get colleagues where, again, we're a university. It's not that the president can willy-nilly change these issues on his or her own. Got to engage in collegial debate and self-reflection as a prerequisite to any change you want to make. But it's here that, not surprisingly, because the assault on the university has been so brutal, the willingness of colleagues at this point to really stand back and say, is there some kernel of truth? Is there something in that critique that might be valuable that we should react to? It's just that much harder. And this is where I think it's really been interesting over the last several months, reflected, for instance, in the Yale report that has received a lot of attention. In a quiet way, watching what Alan Garber has been doing at Harvard, there's a lot of movement that's actually happening around a number of the dimensions that I'm talking about here today to get at some of these issues. But it is hard, but nevertheless, I think slowly but surely, the collegium is recognizing it's less about trying to repair the relationship with the Trump administration and more a sense of we've got to get to a better place with our relationship with the American people. And to do that, we've got to do some of this work on our own to see whether or not we are truly discharging our full responsibility. And that's happening. And I think it's an interesting and in some sense a kind of an exciting moment to be able to be leading an institution involved in this debate. So with that all said, again, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to be here today and to share some of these thoughts about where we stand right now, and to recognize that this is very much still a work in progress, and we'll see, whether slowly but surely we're able to see some level of repair, and to see more people come to the woodwork and worry about the status of our institutions and speaking up to protect us, or whether we're just in a period where everyone's keeping their heads down, and so the responsibility rests on our shoulders alone. With that said, thanks for the opportunity and look forward to the discussion.
I want to make sure that you also get a chance to ask your questions. Oh, thank you. But I wanted to kick off maybe with some, one or two prompts, and then I'm sure there will be a lively discussions. There are many things on our plate. So the intricate or the intrinsic link between universities and democracies, I think we tell the story somehow now something went wrong with democracy, then they attacked universities. And that's essentially what is happening. And you already finished your talk with some sense of self-criticism, and there were a couple of points where you feel that unfortunately Trump says things, and because he says, we are reluctant to think about it. So to cut it short, do universities bear any responsibility for the decline of democracy, or would this overstate the significance of universities in contemporary societies? And if it's the latter, then it would somehow undermine the gist of your book, in which you say that we need to really beef up universities so that we can save democracy from itself. But what did we wrong in the past? To everyone. I mean, this is maybe you want to kick us off, and then
I'll go quickly.
All right.
I think, in some sense I've touched on some of these points in the initial remarks. But I think it's important to keep two perhaps contradictory thoughts. This is Scott Fitzgerald's two contradictory thoughts in your heads at the same time. And I think the first is that we are still, I think, at a very important and very productive and very constructive and very effective institution in American society, and I think we are one of the pillars of liberal democracy, and I think in so many different ways we discharge that responsibility quite admirably. But at the same time, I think there is some, as I've said before, some substance to the critique. It's not as bad. It is not as bad as being as alleged against us. I mean, it's one of the things that's really challenging for us right now. If you look at one of the most defining features of the MAGA coalition is the fact that it is a coalition of people who lack university education. I mean, at least in it's been the last 3 elections we've seen this coalition building, and the sort where again educational achievement is, it turns out to be a key way in which you express your political identity. So, as against that, that political entrepreneurs are going to be able to exploit that unfairly and capitalize on our worst moments, and some of the things we've talked about today will be greatly exaggerated. But having said that, as I said before, there's kernels of truth. If I can channel your answer to maybe focusing a bit on what the difference is between the United States and Europe, because several of the problems you highlighted, high tuition, social selection, really don't apply to, we have rectors from universities that are 25,000, 30,000 students tuition-free essentially, and that's the rule, not the exception. But I don't want to, take away whatever you want to say, Michael and Cornelia. But this is, I think, a point of discussion we have to have tonight. What's the difference between us?
Let me move to the European context because, I did my PhD at Harvard and spent 8 years in the classroom at Harvard. There's simply no doubt that we became part of the problem, in my view. I'm proud of the teaching we did there, but we were accrediting people from around the world to join an accredited elite. and our accreditation was an extremely important element in the social stratification of advanced industrial society. And given that the big social divide is increasingly between those with university degrees and those not, and the shock troops of MAGA were not, we didn't see this because if you were 21 in 1968 and going into university as I was, you were part of a massive expansion of higher education for 60 years, in which we believed that we were expanding access to education, and so we believed we were part of the solution. At the end of that cycle of massive expansion of higher education, in which in Canada, for example, you had 10% of the population having a university degree in 1960, and now it's something like 35 to 40%, and similar numbers in Britain, similar numbers everywhere. We forgot the simple statistic that 60% of the American public do not have college degree. And increasingly, economic advantage is distributed to those with the degrees for a while. Maybe AI will change everything. So I think we became part of we thought we were part of the solution, and we became, by the end of the cycle of this expansion of higher education, part of the problem, and solving it with tuition reform, as everybody needs to know he's led the charge on this, is a terrific part of it. But you come into Harvard Yard and you feel you're in a world entirely on its own. I remember black students that I taught as a TA in the 1970s in tears in my office saying, "You've given me a chance to be here and I do not belong." Right? I'm from a sharecropper's family in South Carolina, and you've lifted me up and put me here, and I'm supposed to be the alibi for your good intentions, and I don't belong. I've never forgotten that experience. So slowly we became part of the problem. The one thing I would say to switch to the European side is one reflection I draw from CEU's experience of our traumatic departure from Hungary. I think it all left us with a feeling, did our university have any connection to Hungarian society? We're an English language university in the middle of Budapest. And did we do enough to cultivate real organic links with that society? Or was our isolation one of the reasons why we were an easy target? I mean, against that, I would say, and I see Jolt here, and I see Agi here, and all the wonderful people we fought with together. We all remember, for me, the most dramatic and moving moment in my life in universities was that moment in May 2017 when 80,000 people crossed the Change Bridge and flooded into Parliament Square. And what were they chanting? They were chanting free universities and a free society. They hadn't read your book, Ron, but they understood it all in one slogan. And I sometimes feel deep gratitude to those Budapest citizens who marched on that day, because it certainly revived my sense of what we do this for. But I sometimes wonder whether we deserved it. Do you know what I mean? That is to say, we were more isolated from that society than was good for us, and it made us an easy mark, is what I would say. I've gone on too long, I'll stop. But I do want to use this moment, because I see so many folks here who were in the battle with us, and it's just, it means a lot to me to see you here today.
Thank you. Let me also start first by maybe coming entirely from the outside. I remember I was sitting, this was over 20 years ago, somewhere in Germany with a professor of mine who's been in a US university for a very long time, and I thought the only real research happens in US universities, and really was happy I had studied there. And then he said, Yes, it's fascinating. We all dream of going to the United States, and they have the most brilliant minds and the best universities, and every time you go, you just want to stay there. But these brilliant places produce some of the most heinous politicians and the worst thinkers of actually tearing down the institutions that they've produced. And back then, by the way, I'll say this because it's funny now, this was against George W. Bush, but ever since then I can do the list of J.D. Vance being Yale trained. You said the MAGA is not university educated or college educated. Trump went to an Ivy League. You have Elon Musk went to got university education. You get very bright tech entrepreneurs coming out of Stanford. These are university educated people, and I keep thinking also of, we have them in the UK as well. Boris Johnson is a very bright Oxford trained person who says that he's learned how to debate just about anything, and whatever gets his career in the right direction is what he'll go. So I also think we have to ask, what about the people we had inside our universities, and what did we do wrong for them to go around with a gun-killing democracy? I'll make it simple. So I don't think it's just accessibility. I don't think it's just the failure of universities to cater to everybody. I think it's something deeper. And let me now point the finger at Germany. So Germany is, of course, the island of the happy few, because university education is basically entirely a public good. It's for free. The debate is how do people then get income in addition so that they can take care of housing. But the universities are accessible. The part we had always considered universities doing a big part through the education to have a bigger and bigger proportion of the population university educated, but it's actually Canada heading that list. I think in Canada, 65% of the population has a university education. Germany's pretty low, it's somewhere between 40 and 45% because we have vocational training. Whatever the argument is, the far right in Germany, the Alternative für Deutschland, which I'm sure you all know, was invented by university professors. So it's not the uneducated against the educated. I really would like us to think differently about what's happening to democracy. And that gets me to my second thought or point. I don't think universities are responsible for what's happening to democracy. I think universities are experiencing in parallel exactly the same shock. And I do think universities have a role to play in democracies. Lee Bollinger calls them the fifth pillar of democracy, one of the countervailing pillars or forces, because universities produce knowledge and do speak truth to power and can correct and criticize, similar to what media is doing, for example, and a bit differently, but also same mechanism of courts have to play as a role. And the attack universities are currently feeling is precisely because they have that function and they can correct and they can be a countervailing force. And so I would rather have us think through what is happening in this attack, what is happening to universities because they have a role to play in democracy, what exactly is being targeted, what are all the levers that are being used, and then in the end, the question that Ron says now is also in the minds of every university president, not just in the US but elsewhere, how can universities be more resilient? Because the attacks are happening in absolutely every place, whether the universities are public or they're private, whether it's from Germany, a country where universities have failed in their historic role already once and didn't want to repeat the same errors again, or whether it's in countries where it's quite easy for the autocrats to say universities should produce what we would like them to produce. So we can go through a lot of different countries. I think the underlying story is the same, and we do have to think about the resilience of this institution, which I do think is crucial for our democratic systems.
I should also add that CEU has its fair share of rough players in the Hungarian regime that came to a fall. So some of the most despicable people had CEU degrees, so we were not exempt. And one thing you said in your talk, you said that conservatives ended up in think tanks in the United States because of the exclusionary nature or atmosphere at universities. I find this utterly interesting, and now that you say it somehow is very clear to me, and it reminded me, I know you went on this book tour on how Vienna made the modern world. You might have learned that the inverse happened in Austria, where in Vienna, universities in the 20s and 30s were actually run by the federal government, and they still are, and they were excluding all these more progressive people who then ended up in the Vienna circles and in homes and discovering things. So apparently something good can come out, but there is fertile ground, which makes me also a bit worried. Why is it that universities don't produce this sort of spark of innovation? Anyway, so and. To formulate maybe as a question, or maybe first a comment, you also said you have purposeful pluralism, and you gave this example of housing policies. I think this is another area where it doesn't travel so easily to Europe because very few have their own housing programs. And you want to do this to overcome polarization. And while I'm the least to say that polarization doesn't exist, I think it's important to point out, and this is a colleague and friend of ours in Germany, a sociologist, who says that on basic things, societies are much less polarized than we believe. It is all political entrepreneurs of the ilk that we have been now listing, who are smart people. I totally buy this. They are educated by us. They know how to play people one against each other. So it is not polarization of society per se, but people who want to trigger. This is what the title of the book, Trigger Points. So I doubt that we can sort of make this do away by putting people who would otherwise not meet in dormitories. We have to take out those actors who play this card. Anyway, I can't make it a question, but I thought I should also comment on things. But I will make it now a question, and it's more about academic freedom in more general terms. And Cornelia, you ended saying that the threats come from many sides, or whether you're private or public. It comes through law, but it also comes through economic means. In Austria, a big debate now, they want to cut the budgets of public universities and everybody is up in arms. So the equivalent, I think, in America or in privately funded institutions is donors and the tuition system. So how much do you feel that the so-called corporatization or neoliberalization or of universities and business interests, how much does this interfere in your fight for universities being useful to society?
So I would say, this as long as I've been a university leader, whether dean, provost, president, this swirl, this anxiety, appropriately so, about corporate influence and how it might distort the mission of the university has been out there. And I think, to be fair, universities have over the years, and when I was at University of Toronto, there were several moments, one in particular, where there was a question of undue influence around the role of a pharmaceutical company and the way in which a trial was being run and publication results and so forth. It was pretty traumatic. But at the end of the day, the university developed a series of mechanisms, I think, for properly ventilating and ensuring that this relationship, these types of relationships were being properly calibrated and ensured that they, in fact, weren't distorting but enriching the mission of the university. I would say that since 2024, we're looking at the question of undue influence and the way in which the mission of the university can be very radically distorted, as in truth coming much more from the public sector than the private sector. And in fact, in an ironic twist, it is increasingly, and even my most progressive colleagues will come to me and say, my research funding is in peril. Is there a chance we might be able to interest a corporation in sponsoring this or that activity? And so in fact, this has actually become, or is there the prospect for private donative activity to temper the impact that we're experiencing from the federal government? And that's true, not just at the level of the federal government, its role vis-a-vis private universities, but again, state universities, where, as so much of what's being played out now at the federal level in the United States has been played out for several years now in the we talk about state laboratories for experimentation. There's been a lot of experimentation that is now informing what I think is quite a ruthless attack on the university at the national level. And again, it's in that setting where tuition, private philanthropy, corporate foundation support becomes a way in which you can temper that. So I think it's important to just note that. I think it's probably also just worth saying, and I have, it will surprise you when I share the following statistic with you, but for years, it's been quiet the last 20 or 30 years, but for many years, when the so-called Great Compact between the federal government and United States research universities was first established in the wake of the Second World War, and this idea that the federal government would go in and through merit-based allocation, invest lots of funds in the research mission of the universities. And when you go back, and as I have recently, to take a look at what some of my predecessors said, there were these regular moments where they're saying, are we becoming too dependent on the federal government? Is this going to distort our mission? Is it going to, in some way, impair our independence as a university? And of course, for 70 years, this has been an incredibly productive relationship. You know, at times we don't get exactly what we'd hoped for in terms of the increase in the appropriation, but by and large, it's been great. But here's the statistic that says so much. Johns Hopkins University receives more federal research funding than any other university in the country. And guess how much of my budget comes from one source? 55%. So when that one source decides to basically withdraw from its research commitments, you know, we've seen the past year, we've basically, when you look at new grant awards, we've lost about $500 million last year. We're on scale to lose another $500 million in new awards this year. I mean, this is just crushing. And to the extent that we worried about private support philanthropy, should we take that $2 million gift, which is going to generate 4% a year in endowment? Is that going to really distort the mission of the university? Imagine what it means to say that you're going to lose, you know, for us, which could be over the period of 5 years, could be somewhere in the order of 40% of our total budget. So, you know, if one talks about influence and the capacity to destabilize the university, that's where I'm focused these days.
So diversification of income, I hear you say. Maybe, yes, it would got too much prominence, some cases where donors said, if you allow this to happen on campus, I will not give you money, and this was still only a share or a fraction. Exactly.
Modest influence, and we have ways of disciplining that. We've learned those lessons.
Exactly. So maybe Michael, then Cornelia, or any order, where have you experienced in your reign limitations or influence that didn't come from the usual suspects, like of the Orban?
Look, I think any time an institution receives money from anywhere, you face an issue of potential pressure. I mean, this university exists because of the staggering generosity of one man and one family. Do they exert pressure on our freedom? By and large, they have been extremely good in leaving us alone. But let's not be cute about this. It's a battle. It's a battle. It's your job to maintain the independence of the institution, as it was mine, and it goes on. But this is of an order of magnitude of pressure. We don't receive huge amounts of government funding to run our labs and this kind of stuff, because we don't do labs, we do other stuff. But this kind of pressure is unprecedented. I think something that my colleague here said earlier is I think right, that one of the ways to frame what's going on is simply that universities are now massively important and powerful institutions in ways that they weren't 60, 70 years ago. They're the center of most of the basic science that creates most of the innovation that powers most of a modern economy. They are the key accreditation path into the middle class. They are an enormous source of cultural power, and these powerful institutions are now under attack as part of a general attack by politically interested parties and politically interested entrepreneurs who are attacking all of the countervailing powers. I mean, you can't understand what's happening to the universities unless you understand the attacks on the judiciary. You can't understand the attacks on universities unless, I was at a meeting in Salzburg 3 days ago in which extremely well-paid, powerful American lawyers were debating earnestly among themselves as to whether they should have stood up more or accepted the pressure that Donald Trump put on some of the biggest law firms in the United States. These are cases you know well. So we're in a phalanx of countervailing institutions, all of which are being attacked by majoritarian illiberalism of a kind we saw in Hungary. And the reason that our story is interesting is that it started with us, in a sense. The consolidation of centralized authority, they didn't care about CEU. It was part of a much bigger project to bring all of the Hungarian universities under control, to bring all of the private sector under control, to get hold of all of the European money and control its disbursement to their friends, to create a national bourgeoisie entirely dependent on their say-so. That was the project. We were a tiny little part of a much bigger project. And if that's the case, then it has consequences, political consequences for us, which is we need to know who the enemy is and fight back hard. I strongly approve of what you were doing in your talk, Ron, which is to say, we got to look at ourselves carefully. We've got to make sure we are faithful to our mission and to our best principles. I get that. But we've goddamn well got to identify where this attack's coming from and fight it. And point one, and point two, make alliances with all the people who are similarly under attack. The judges, the legal profession, the heroic people in civil society who, for example, as we speak, are trying to guarantee free and fair elections in the midterm elections in the United States. There's a whole bunch of civil society institutions trying to defend something as basic as a free election. All of this, all of us are under attack similarly and need to, it seems to me, respond as best we can.
So your question was about the dependence and where exactly the power games came from. Let me maybe step back, because a lot of things have said that I simply agree with, but let's just, I know everybody in the room knows it, but speak again. What is the fundamental mission of universities? The one thing that we really, the business in which we are, is the pursuit of knowledge. And I do think that the pursuit of knowledge and the capacity to transmit that is of enormous societal value. And a lot of people want to control exactly what is right and wrong, true to a certain degree, or what we know and how we transmit that. And that is true for donors. They're interested in universities. They think we need places, but they have opinions about what exactly is produced inside the universities. Political actors, of course, as well, but also the communities of the universities. And that's normal, because in, I think, all of our understanding, the pursuit of knowledge is always, I want to say a battle to make it sound dramatic, but it's always a dialogue. There's the dissent, criticism is inbuilt in this pursuit, and that is the rule of the game we teach to everybody, and that's how research is produced. You can always criticize, you go back, you test, etc. Now, this whole back and forth is what we're the guardians of. And in the beginning, you asked us what were we guilty of, or what haven't we done in the past? And I think the one thing that we do have to acknowledge is everything that we put out there has always has to have the possibility of being challenged. And so we are the guardians of the method, the scientific method, and the rules of the game, a bit like in a football game. We are never, as universities institutionally or as university administration standing for these institutions, the guardians of any one specific content, however good, morally high-grounded it may be. And I think what we're being accused of from the outside is to have produced too much of this or too much of that. Maybe that's true. But what I think is the difficult part in current times that all university presidents have to deal with is that they have a double responsibility. They have a responsibility to, because the criticism is always in the hands of the individuals, of faculty or students. Students have free speech, protest rights, whatever, the faculty has all the academic freedoms. And that means they will speak out on things that some people don't like. And it's the role of the university to protect every single one of these individuals. But it is also the role of the university to make sure none of them captures what the university is in essence. None of them pretends to speak for the whole. Because the moment any one of the members of our community speaks for the whole, it kills all the dissenting voices that make up our fundamental mission. So we have a double responsibility, and it's highly uncomfortable because I would say in current times, not in office I can't say it, we're unable to protect members of our community. Once you are a target of a vicious online campaign targeting you for some research finding, university presidents will do, I hope, everything they can to protect you, but it's going to be a very, very rough ride, and it's hard to live through. And we're currently having a case in Germany of a colleague receiving death threats from students, and she basically had to leave the university. There are other cases that many people know. But at the same time also, it's very hard to push back against somebody capturing what the university stands for. When you have a scientific development that is very strong, there's not a lot of contradiction, standing up and saying we're allowing contradiction, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it's socially not very accepted, even if it sounds like it's morally reprehensible, the university has to say, just because you feel like you're right and because it's in even the most scientific mind's intuition to want to speak for the whole, you will not be allowed to speak for the whole. That's very hard. And so that is why all the dependence on the donors, the politicians, and everybody else is also very hard, because what do the university presidents do? They try to make the organization survive. That means economically, politically, all sorts of things. That means they have to speak with everybody, they have to diversify their income, they have to make the donor feel like we're doing what they're interested in doing, but we're also doing other things, and of course nobody should influence. So it's a whole game of making sure that environment gets somehow stable. And at the same time, they turn to their communities and say, you're entirely free, you can say whatever you want, you can do whatever you want, you can protest however you want, and kind of make sure nobody finds this hypocritical, which to a certain degree it's constantly turning around. And the pressure that weighs on people like Michael in the particular period in which you led this university, but of course Ron and everybody of the colleagues that are currently going through hell, is such that we see a phenomenon with university presidents called the university presidential turnover crisis. Presidents are leaving office, in particular in the US, where we have more data, at a higher rate than ever before. Turnover is at 23% in the last college and university president ranking. 70 years is a complete fluke, or however many years you are. The average term just dropped below 6 years. It used to be 6.5 only a couple of years ago. It used to be almost 9 years, 15 years back. So becoming a university president is just living hell. I send you to look at the rector of Belgrade University in Serbia being raided by the police, 11 hours locked in his office because the Serbian students are protesting. One would want to add, as they should, but of course it gets you to be the person having to stand up for this. You know of all the cases from Claudine Gay to Minouche Shafik to any other of the presidents that had to leave office, University of Virginia. The list is long. So the job you have done, Michael, and I'm here to celebrate what you've done for CEU, is really a very tough one in a very tough setting. I admire what other colleagues are currently doing in the US, because the pressure is very high from the outside, but also from the inside. And if I can just say one line to the inside, the one thing that should happen within a university community is to support one another, even though our natural tendency is that we're here to criticize and to move the university forward. But once the university speaks towards the outside, the community kind of has to stick together and agree that they are playing by the rules, they're dissenting, but they're not trying to break one another. And that's hard during current times, because every internal discussion is also an external one. So that's the line I find hardest to hold.
You said nice things about me, for which I'm deeply grateful. But I do think it's important to say to this group especially that I had it easy. We were attacked. Nothing like that attack had ever happened to most universities in Europe. And the minute it did, this place either came together or we drowned. It wasn't hard. I mean, I did my job, but the people in this room got us through this. It was a group effort because our community was threatened with closure. If we had to have a donor who would support us through thick and thin, and I did something to help that happen. But, you know, think about it. We had to move a university across a national frontier in the middle of COVID. We had to secure accreditation in another country. We had to transfer people's lives, their salaries, their pensions, everything to another jurisdiction. We had to accredit 2 new undergraduate programs, and we had to get this thing through a crisis that concentrated every mind in the building. I mean, in a way, if you were the leader of this, all you had to do is remind people how serious the situation was. They didn't need much reminding. Their jobs are on the line. Their future was on the line. And the fact that we'd already been in place for 25 years meant that many people had a visceral community attachment to what this place was trying to do. And it was very easy to tap into it. It was in the souls of so many people in this room. So, you know, I want to take all possible credit to myself, but I can't really take very much credit at all. This was a community effort, and it succeeded precisely because we were under pressure. I would say that the most difficult period for this university came afterwards, when we got here, and then we had, I think, a claim that you were mentioning, I thought, very effectively in your comments just now, in which the university faces a strain between the right that we all feel as individuals to speak, defend our own research, speak for ourselves. We're all a bunch of highly entrepreneurial, single actors. But sometimes the question that I found myself asking sometimes when there were very divisive demonstrations at this university was, what do we still share? What holds us together now that we've got to safety? I'm not nostalgic for the times when we were under fire. It was bloody awful. But I do ask myself, and it's a question for our 35th anniversary, what do we share as a community? What values are we willing to put ahead of our own advancement, ahead of our own free speech rights, ahead of our own convictions? Sometimes you have to put the community first. And that's, I think, one of the deepest issues for universities under pressure. And one of the things that, you know, Ron, you've had to deal with, your university's under existential pressure, and you have to hold people together. You have to keep a community together. And that's, seems to me, the leadership challenge that you've been under, and I'm kind of amazed that you've been able to do it, you know.
We will open the floor for questions. I have to respectfully sort of counter your claim that you cannot take any credit for this. I remember this press conference when before, for those who weren't present, I think we tried to keep our head low. And at one point, it seemed to me, I wasn't part of leadership, he said, now it's enough, we just go full out. I happened to be in Spain, and I don't know why I could watch it on TV, I still don't know, but it was on TV. Somehow I watched this, and I was really in tears. And I thought, okay, I'm in. And you did this to hundreds of people, and then when people said, oh, poor you lost, you had to move. And I thought to myself, honestly, that's what you think, that was a battle, but the war isn't over, and look who is still celebrating their birthday and which prime minister isn't in power anymore. So it's all went out, went well. So please, if you could introduce yourself, and as Michael tends to say, a question is a sentence with a question mark at the end.
Yes. Hello, my name is Botan Pap. I am an alumni and an incoming student at the same time. I've encountered Michael for the first time during that protest wave among the 85,000 Hungarians that you just mentioned. And one of the question is essentially, don't you think that it's that maybe that the fact that that protest group itself, of course, CEU was embedded with those 85,000 people, but that 85,000 people was themselves not so much embedded with the rest of the country. Maybe point us towards why then, 10 years? I don't know. But basically this year down the line, when this alliance of Hungarians from Budapest with millions of people outside of Budapest was reinforced, this embeddedness was reestablished, then ousting Orban was a success? I don't know. Is that a question mark at the end?
Yes, who wants to take it?
I'd like to think that extraordinary demonstration in May 2017 was the harbinger of what came afterwards. But let's also pay homage to the tremendous political work that was done. I was once asked in 2015 by the then opposition in Hungary, what do you have to do to beat Orban? And I said, you got to go out on a rainy Thursday night to a small hotel or sports hall in a small town, even a village in Hungary. And it's raining and there are only 5 people there. And you have to do it 1,000 times. And that's how you beat Viktor Orban. And guess what happened? That's what the current Prime Minister of Hungary did for 2 years, solidly. My wife Susanna's here, she's Hungarian. She signed up early, went to the meetings early. He came to her hometown. There were, 75 people. 4 days before the election, when we went to his rally, there were 1,000 people. That's how you do it. So I think there was always a feeling in Budapest that we must have something better than this. This regime does not speak for us. But it was decisively important to get out into the country and just show up and show up and show up and show up. All the hard work was tremendously impressive as a political. And I think it means that it's terribly important for us because it changes our future in many ways. And it'll be up to Carsten and my successors to figure out how to take advantage of this new moment. But I think it is a new moment. And I think we can be proud that we stood up to that regime. But I would just, I'm sorry, I'm talking too much, but I would make one point that needs to be said over and over and over again. When people ask me what I'm proudest of about that whole experience, it was that at no point did we interrupt our educational program for 1 minute. We graduated every student we admitted for that whole 5-year period. Everybody we accepted got a degree. We preserved the uninterrupted continuity of our educational offering through the most difficult political crisis any university in Europe has faced since the Second War. And that is something on our 31st anniversary we should be quietly proud of, because that again was every professor, every member of this team doing their damn jobs.
If your question, it's and your comment before, Michael, where you said that we were isolated in Budapest, and I think what you mean is that we were very privileged. In a nice building. I think we paid very good salaries, students got very good stipends. But at the same time, it's also true that we brought to campus students who would otherwise not have been on this campus. So it wasn't an elite group of students at all. So I think some of the support, these 85,000, many had nothing to do with CEU, and they did it genuinely out of the unfairness it was. And CEU itself had many, not only from Hungary, but from the entire regions, students, first generation scholars, and we did fulfill our social mission, and we're not impenetrable elite despite the appearance. Any other question or comment? Please.
Well, I adhere to the strict rules. What is academic resilience and where is the red line?
So boy, we're constantly asking ourselves that question now. The thought experiment that I'm constantly urging on the deans whom I work with, the senior leadership team, the trustees, is I say, let's think about this through the 20-year test. 20 years hence, what are people going to say about how we met this moment? Constantly thinking about whether we will have seen to have abdicated our responsibilities, to have indulged cowardice over courage, some sense of undue pragmatism at the expense of principle, or whether it's the opposite. So I think it's in that moment when you're constantly, again, you gotta always think about what is fundamental here. Academic freedom, protecting the right of the faculty to critique, and open debate in the student body. These are the things that are just absolutely critical. And, again, to the extent that I and other university presidents show some degree of prudence of when we speak out, how we speak out, I always say to the faculty and the students around me, what I do, particularly as the head of the university, is a lot different than what you ought to be doing. And so you shouldn't construe this moment as a time when you've got to somehow exhibit exquisite levels of self-censorship. My role is to give you the space to do what you need to do and to see that as the ultimate form of resilience, that we continue the mission. But it's hard, really hard in terms of steering the institution in the right place. The institutions, when I think about Columbia and Northwestern and Cornell, that very early on in the administration had their funding completely, turned off. And how you think about what the right way to meet that moment is, do you sue, do you negotiate? And, and I constantly tell colleagues as there's lots of tracking, armchair critics of who did well, who didn't, and so forth. And I keep saying, I think you've got to maintain some humility about how we actually see these institutions in the moment, because there's just so much at stake, and how ultimately you get through this. I think there's not just one choice and one clear line, but I do go back to, I think you've got to just recognize and as you would expect, there's lots of time that I've spent with other university presidents, and an agreement that there's just some things that are such a fundamental affront that you would have to, in some sense, in my case, risk the 55% of my revenue, because to get through this, but to have squandered your core identity through this, your core values, I think ultimately would be far too damaging. But it's not always the case. It's as dramatic as it was, with Columbia, and and there's lots of move for titration and thinking what is most prudential in meeting this, and ultimately knowing what you're trying to do is ensure that the institution gets through this in a way that doesn't sell its soul, and it isn't a shadow of itself.
Do you want to take the last word on this?
No, I think you should.
No.
I had one thought, because I think it's a wonderful question. The red line question, for example, came up at Harvard in the spring. Alan Garber was told he could get his research funding released if he signed a compact with the federal government of the United States that basically sacrificed the academic freedom of his institution. And he said, can't do it. Red line was real clear. I think resilience is political in a way that I had to learn in this thing. I had to learn, having been in politics, but then becoming a rector of a university, that a university is not a political party. It's not a political organization. and it is up against a political opponent. And so you're in a very, very difficult, you could be lured into a political game of defiance, for example, towards a political authority, which ends in the destruction of the institution. I mean, there were people in Budapest who said, you know, don't go to Vienna. Don't, I mean, you know, stay and fight. And if they padlock the place, you know, and I thought, that's not my role here. My role is to assure the unbroken continuity of our educational offering, come hell or high water, for our students. That's how I defined the goal. That's what I had to achieve, and we did it. But you see, resilience involves a very important choice. And it's very important as a university leader to think, and I was talking with Ron last night, and Ron was talking about this last night, it's not about you. It's about the institution. It's about handing the institution on. And so you got to be clear about your goals. And the final thing I'd say is go to Padua in Italy. Go to the University of Padua in Italy. The first thing you see is that this university has been going for 900 years, right? It had Galileo on its faculty. Galileo was put through the Inquisition and came out saying, but it still moves, right? It's an institution that has known fascism, that's known good governments, bad governments, it's still there. It always pays to remember that we are part of one of the oldest institutions in the world. Governments come and go, and we are still here.
That sounds like a great final one.
That sounds like a great final one. Indeed. Thank you so much to everyone.